American English, American English, American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Welcome everyone to our 5th session in American English Webinar Series 5, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Let's start our session today with a great photo submitted by Rohani Sianipar of a viewing group at Bayangkara Jaya University in Jakarta, Indonesia. The teachers pictured here gathered to watch webinar 5.4 earlier this month. We love to see teachers learning together, so please keep sharing your webinar viewing photos by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We may feature them in the next webinar. My name is Katie Subra, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator KDS. You'll also see moderators Heather and Lauren in the chat box to help you during this webinar. We'll assist and support you as you participate. Here you can see the exciting schedule for this series. Our final Series 5 webinar, Photography in ELT, Engage, Inspire, Create, Learn by Crystal Bach-Thiessen, will be in 2 weeks on March 29th. Here you can see the schedule for American English Webinar Series 6, which will begin in 7 weeks on May 3rd. Registration for Series 6 will open soon. Please contact your local regional English language office or U.S. Embassy to register. We are looking forward to another great series. Our webinars are each 60 minutes long. Webinars are often related to a theme found on the American English website. The Teacher's Corner section from the website, shown here, features resources and lesson ideas related to the month's topic. The theme for March is Increasing Learner Engagement. Next, let's look at how you will participate in the webinars. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is by typing in the chat box, as many of you are already doing. The chat box is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over. The main community for teachers, which we'll look at in more detail momentarily. The presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on your screen for you to answer. Some people may experience technical problems during the webinar, but we will let you know if we are having a global problem. If you do lose sound, you can follow along with the caption pod at the bottom of the screen. And you can try refreshing your internet browser if that does not correct the problem. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy after the series ends. To ensure you are eligible for an e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, you will visit the link that is shown on the screen, and we will give you additional information about how to fill out the requested information form. We hope many of you are already MIN community members, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join us. It may take up to 72 hours for your Ning registration to be approved, especially at the beginning of a new series. But once you are in the Ning, you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings and featured materials. The Ning is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar and live chat with fellow community members. Finally, before we begin, a quick reminder that March is Women's History Month. You can use this resource from the American English website to teach your students about some famous firsts from women's history. To find this resource and other resources, you can check out the American English website after today's webinar. And now for today's webinar, Learner Training, Developing Student Autonomy to Increase Engagement. Today we will learn about the importance of incorporating learner training into the English language learning curriculum. Our presenter will address the benefits for integrating effective learner training into the English language classroom and some strategies for increasing students' metacognitive awareness about their own learning, as well as their confidence in their ability to succeed. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Maggie Steingraber. Maggie Steingraber lives in Lima, Peru, where she serves as an English language fellow. She works with the Peruvian Ministry of Education in the Department of Initial Teacher Training to reform national curriculum guidelines and strengthen classroom methodologies. Maggie holds a BA in Linguistics from the University of Wisconsin and an MA in TESOL from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. She specializes in curriculum design and materials development, as well as teacher training and educational technology. She has previously worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in the United States, China, India, Argentina, and Chile. Welcome, Maggie.
Thank you. Hello to everyone from Lima, Peru. I am excited to be here with you today to talk about a topic that I love, which is learner training. So today we are going to discuss the what, why, and how of this important element of language learning and teaching that oftentimes is overlooked in the classroom. So we had a couple of polls from the beginning just to get you thinking about the topic. The first one was, what is learner training, just to see if you're familiar with the topic. So telling learners to do what you say, teaching learners strategies to learn better, and getting learners in great physical shape. I think pretty much 99% of people had identified B. The answer is teaching learners strategies to learn better, which is correct. The other two were just some silly things to get you thinking. The other poll that I had was on if you agree that teachers can teach strategies for their students to learn better. And I'm happy to see that 100% of you agreed and said that yes, it is possible for teachers to teach strategies to their learners. So I'm happy to hear that. All right, we'll go, just to begin, give you a quick overview of what you can expect in this webinar in the next hour. So as a result of this webinar, we want you to be able to recognize the various forms and functions of learner training. You'll see throughout this webinar I use LT, that stands for learner training. So whenever you see LT, I am referring to learner training. So we want you to recognize the forms and functions of it, understand the benefits of strategy instruction, use learner training to solve common classroom problems, and feel confident implementing learner training practices into your classrooms. So we here at American English create a lot of content for learners and teachers, but so do our friends at the British Council. And here's how they define learner training. Learner training involves helping learners find out how they learn most effectively. It means encouraging learners to take responsibility for learning and helping them to develop learning strategies and study skills. Most importantly, it asks learners to reflect on how they are learning. The aim of learner training is to produce effective, independent language learners. Now, this is a long definition, but I like it because it has certain components that I think are important to point out. First being the idea of taking responsibility for learning. Another, the idea of developing learning strategies. And finally, asking learners to reflect. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what each of those terms means. The first being take responsibility for learning. This is that idea of autonomy and its independence in language use, so that learners are responsible for their own learning and their own use of the language. The next term I identified is develop learning strategies. Learning strategies are tools to help learners learn. Throughout this webinar, as we go on, I'm going to better define this. So for now, just think of strategies as learning tools. And the last term, asking learners to reflect. This is encourage learners to think about what they are doing and how they are progressing. This is making sure that the learner is self-aware and that there is a focus on the process of learning and not just on an end result or goal. So for example, you want your learners to be involved in the entire process of learning and not just on achieving a native fluency or getting a good grade in your class or a high score on the TOEFL. So teachers have a lot of roles, and a lot of people define them in different ways. I've identified a couple that I think are most common. So we'll go through each one. The first one is that of a supportive caretaker. So this is the teacher as a person who nurtures and aids in the growth. The other is a captivating performer. This is the idea of a teacher as the performer, the person who leads, who is in the front of the class, there to entertain and intrigue the students. The next is the teacher as the all-knowing master, a person who imparts his or her expert knowledge onto others. And the fourth, the teacher as an admired older sibling, or someone who students can look up to, a good role model, or a person who is looked up to because of what he or she has accomplished. So let's take a poll. Of these four roles, which do you think best describes your idea of the role of a teacher? So the supportive caretaker, the captivating performer, who is leading the class through entertainment, the all-knowing master, who is the expert, never to be questioned, or an admired older sibling or a role model. All right, there are a lot of responses coming in, and there is a very strong preference towards one. I'll leave it open for a little bit longer, and we'll see. Captivating, we have supportive caretaker, captivating performer, all-knowing master, and admired older sibling. Well, from what I can see, about 85% of you agree with the first one of the supportive caretaker. So you see the teacher as being a nurturer, someone who helps the students grow. All right, the second one was the captivating performer at 10%, but that's good. It gives an interesting insight into how you see the role of the teacher. So we'll move on. I have this quote that I found. I'll read it to you. Teaching is nothing more than showing someone that something is possible. Raise your hand if you agree with this quote. Teaching is nothing more than showing someone that something is possible. I've seen a lot of hands go up very quickly, so I think a lot of people can identify with this quote. Yeah, a lot of hands, they keep coming. That's good. All right. So I want to talk a little bit more about the role of the teacher and what they do in the classroom, or what their role is with their students. The first is that of providing opportunities for interaction. So as we all know, language is a skill that must be practiced. And the job of the teacher is to provide students with the guidance and the opportunities for practice. And ideally trying to make those opportunities as authentic and real as possible, which leads to the next line, the next idea, which is making language real. Connecting those dots so that language becomes something that has real-world importance and need. I think this is a particularly important point in an EFL classroom versus an ESL classroom, so as a foreign language versus as a second language. Students in a foreign language classroom often need that help in making the connection to English, especially if they're not surrounded in it. So having that push and that connection as to why this is important and why this is going to help them. And the last point I have is to create independent language users. So you want your students to be able to function successfully and effectively outside of the class as well as in it. If you have students who are very successful in the classroom, but as soon as they go out into the real world and start communicating without you standing next to them, and they're unable to do it, then they're not being effective communicators. So a couple of terms, we'll start getting into learner training. A couple of terms that I want to define. The first is cognition. And cognition is just thinking. Thinking and the thought process. So we're going to talk, and I think I had mentioned it earlier, on cognitive learning strategies. And these are deliberate manipulations of language or thought in order to aid learning and understanding. So cognitive learning strategies, again, techniques, actions, and behavior that learners employ to aid their learning and understanding. So here are a couple examples. There's many more, but these are a couple that I've identified. The first is flashcards. These are often used for retaining vocabulary or learning new vocabulary. I'll show examples of these later. A vocabulary journal, which is often student-generated, and it's a record of new vocabulary, typically a word, definition, and a sample sentence. Another is a mnemonic device. This is a device that assists in remembering. So maybe a rhyme, or an abbreviation, or an acronym, or some kind of association. Note-taking is on how to make organized notes and take them effectively. Highlighting, so that you know what to highlight, so that you don't just have an entire paper of yellow or orange or neon. Graphic organizers are tables or charts that help you to break down the information of a text. Jazz chants are rhymes that are often repeated multiple times to enhance memorization. And goes with repetition, which doesn't necessarily have the rhythm of a jazz chant, but repeating a word to help it stick. So when you were learning English or a different second language, we'll take a quick poll. Which of these learning strategies did you use? Which ones helped you the most, or which ones have you tried? And you can check all that apply. So if you've tried all of them, you can check all of them. If you've only tried a couple, check the ones that you tried. So flashcards, vocabulary journals, mnemonic devices, note-taking, highlighting, graphic organizer, jazz chants, or repetition. All right, a lot of answers are coming in. Leave it open for a little bit longer. Think back to when you were learning English. And if English is your first language, think to when you were learning a different language. Or if you've learned a language other than English, what helped you? All right, it looks like a lot of people, almost 75% of people, have used flashcards. Those seem to be the most popular, along with note-taking. Note-taking jumped up. And the other one, highlighting. I think those are the top 3 answers, followed by vocabulary journals in 4th place. All right, good. So it seems like you have experience with strategies. So we'll move on. The other part of cognition, the next step with learner training. So if cognition was thinking, metacognition is thinking about thinking. So as you can see from the graphic here, it is understanding how you learn. So thinking about your learning process. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. We'll give a couple different examples for it. The first is being aware. So raising metacognitive awareness as to what your personal learning style and preference is. So learning styles, VARC is often the abbreviation for it: visual, auditory, read, write, and kinesthetic. It's this idea that everyone has some preference as to the way that they take in information. So the first is visual, and visual is a preference for things that you see. So these could be things like graphs, charts, diagrams, maps. The second is auditory. Auditory is listening, things that you hear. So lectures, stories, guest speakers, chats. When you hear something, you learn it best. The third is reading and writing. So these are things like note-taking, lists, and written texts. And the fourth one is kinesthetic, which has to do with senses and movements. So these are things like practical exercises, trial and error, doing examples. So we'll take another poll. I'm sure a lot of you may have taken a quiz, or just from reflecting on your own learning. Which of these 4 learning styles do you think best describes your learning preference? So are you visual? You need to see things. Auditory, you need to hear things. Reading and writing, you need to see text or write the text. And kinesthetic, which is physical movement. Wow, there is a very strong preference among this group. So about 60% of people have a strong visual preference, followed by the reading and writing, about 20%. I also have a visual preference, so you can see from the slides that I put together, everything is very visual. There's a lot of images, so that is indicative of my visual preference as well. And it looks like 60% of you also share my same learning style. So, great. Another type of metacognitive awareness is multiple intelligences. So this is the idea that each person has their own strength. So aside from just an IQ number or looking at intelligence in one way, recognizing that people have different strengths in different areas. So a couple examples, and this has been expanded to other areas, but I believe the main 7 are visual spatial, which shows an intelligence towards physical space and environment. So people who have a visual spatial preference might be very good at things like jigsaw puzzles and map reading. Another one is bodily kinesthetic. That's an intelligence towards body awareness, so things like dancing and role-playing. Another is musical, which is rhythm and sound. Interpersonal, which is understanding and interacting with others, so having good social or people skills. Intrapersonal means an understanding of yourself, of introspection, of reflection. Linguistic is the next, and that is being able to use words effectively through things like poetry or word games. And the last one is logical, mathematical, So these are people who are very good at reasoning and calculating. So which multiple intelligence do you most identify with? We'll take another poll. Of these 7 options, which one do you think, for you personally, is your strongest? Visual spatial, bodily kinesthetic, movement, dance, musical, interpersonal, remember, is about people-to-people communication, whereas intrapersonal has to do with reflection, with self-awareness. Linguistic is words, and logical mathematical, calculations, equations, those types of things. So once again, it seems like there is another strong preference. A little more than half of you have identified with visual spatial. Looks like the second most popular is interpersonal, which makes sense for English teachers to have good interpersonal skills, as language is communication. So yeah, visual spatial, interpersonal, great. All right, seems like there's a lot of awareness here about how we learn and how we think. So I'm happy to see it. I've identified one more part of metacognitive awareness, and this goes a little more with sharpening that intrapersonal skill, and that is through self-assessment. So that is asking students to reflect on their own abilities. I'll give you an example of one that is often used and pretty well known, that is a KWL chart. So KWL looks at what students know, what they want to know, and then at the end, reflecting on what they have learned. So to do something like a KWL chart, before a unit or a project or any kind of learning unit begins, you want to overview it, present the topic, and ask your students to reflect on what they already know about that topic. And then also think about what they don't know about that topic or what they want to learn more about. So you start, before you get into the unit, have them think and assess their own knowledge in terms of the K and the W. After the learning unit has ended, you return to this chart. So you either have them keep it, put it away in a folder, or you as the teacher could collect it and give it back to them at the end, where they then go back and review what they'd written down in the K and the W, and complete the chart by filling in the L with what they've learned. And that's another way to get them to reflect on the knowledge they've gained and the process that they've gone through in whatever the learning period was. And it looks like from the chat that a lot of you are very familiar with KWL. I see a lot of teachers making comments that they use it or they recommend it to others. So I'm happy to see it's an effective tool, and it gets learners thinking about their own experiences and the gap that they need to, from where they are to where they need to go. So let's talk about the benefits of learner training. The first benefit is increased self-efficacy. Self-efficacy may not be a term you're familiar with, but I'm sure that you understand the concept. The concept just basically means believing in yourself. So it's the perceived ability of a person to successfully complete a task. So if you think you can do something, you would be more likely to be able to do it, versus someone who thinks it's too difficult or too hard or they're unable to do it, are going to be less likely to complete it just because of their own perceptions. So raise your hand if you agree with the statement that when you believe in your ability to do something, you're better able to do it. How many of you agree with that? A lot of hands are going up fast again. Yeah, I'm happy to see that. And that's something to keep in mind when interacting with students, that their confidence and their belief in their ability to do something can greatly affect their ability to actually do it. And I see a lot in the chat box who are saying that self-confidence leads to success. I like that idea. So it's an idea to keep in mind with students, and you want to make sure that you're always building them up and not knocking them down to increase that self-efficacy. And that's something that learner training can do, or to help to increase anyways. The other benefit is learner autonomy. We've used this word, or this idea a couple times has been mentioned. And that is taking control of your own learning through heightened metacognitive awareness and self-confidence. Remember that metacognitive is thinking about your thinking, so knowing about how you learn. So through knowing about how you learn and having the confidence to complete the task, and having the cognitive skills as well, from what we've talked about before, you'll be a more independent learner. You'll be more resourceful and self-sufficient. So I've identified 4 different components of learner training based on all of these key ideas that we've looked at and all of these terms. We have the first, learning about yourself. Learning about yourself is that idea of metacognitive awareness, knowing about yourself as a learner, how you learn, what your interests are, what you like. So knowing yourself as a person, as a learner. The second is learning by yourself. This goes back to that idea of learner autonomy. So making sure that learners know how to answer their own questions, work on their own. And the third, learning from others, or learning from each other. So this has to do with social interaction and also with teaching style, but being open to learn from others and bounce ideas off each other. I'll go into examples of all of these things. We'll go more depth into each one. And the fourth one is learning from yourself. Learning from yourself is the idea of reflection, going back and being able to focus on the process and see how far you've come. So let's look at each one individually to give you a better idea of what I'm referring to with each one. The first one was learning about yourself. This is allowing students to discover and maximize their personal learning styles and preferences. So this goes back to those learning styles like the metacognitive quiz. You could do a VARC quiz where you have students in class take a survey to discover if they're visual, if they're auditory, if they're kinesthetic. Can also get them thinking about their intelligence. What are they good at? Diverse forms of input go with that. So once you are aware of how your students learn, you as the teacher can be sure to use diverse forms of input to explain new concepts, give new vocabulary, whatever you may be doing in your class that day. So you may be visual, but your students may have a very strong auditory preference or kinesthetic preference or reading and writing. So it's important as teachers to be aware of these learning styles and preferences so that we can accommodate our students' needs and preferences in the classroom for their own learning. And the last one is freedom of expression in production tasks. So going back to that idea of strengths and intelligences is allowing students, when it comes to producing language, to giving them freedom in how they want to produce. If you have a student who's very musical, allowing them to create a song. Or if you have a student who's very artistic, allowing them to put some artwork together, to draw and explain, or to tell a story. So there's different ways of producing and presenting, and letting students choose which one suits their own interests and their own preferences will generate a deeper motivation in them and a little more passion and drive as they can express themselves in a way that they see fit and interesting to them. The next is learning by yourself. So this is encouraging learners to develop their own cognitive strategies and resources. So at this point, we'll go through what each of these strategies are, in case you're unfamiliar with them. Those cognitive strategies, remember, are those manipulations of language for the purpose of helping you to learn it. And also resources. So showing learners where they can go to find information so that they're not relying on you all the time to be a translator or a dictionary. So we have flashcards, vocabulary journals, mnemonic devices, interaction with text. So teaching students tips and skills and strategies for things like highlighting and note-taking. And also showing them language reference materials. Things like good dictionaries. These could either be monolingual dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, where you get a translation, a thesaurus, which gives you synonyms or words that are similar. A thesaurus often will also give you antonyms if you want to see words that are opposite or different. And many dictionaries, and I'll show you a few in just a second, also have different features in them, like Corpus or forums. And like I said, we'll go through some examples so you can see what I'm talking about with this. The first, I think 75%, or how many of you said that you have experience with flashcards. So for those of you who are not sure what I mean by this, flashcards are little cards that usually are for learning new vocabulary. So you can see in these examples, these cards would be for learning animal vocabulary. You often would have the picture of what the word is with the word. There's many ways that you can do flashcards. Some people like to have the translation. Some people would have a sentence that you could use it in. Another thing people like to do is have a picture on one side and the word on the other. So that way they can quiz themselves by having to flip back and forth to see if they remember what the word is. Flashcards can be used for self-study. They can also make for games as well. They could be used in class, out of class. And one thing with flashcards is letting students personalize their flashcards. So get a stack of blank index cards and have them draw their own pictures or write their own definitions. This one I saw a lot of questions on what this is, a mnemonic device. I'll explain it. The word might be new, mnemonic, but I'm sure the concept is probably something that you're very familiar with. So this is a rhyme, an acronym, or an abbreviation, or an association that is used to help you remember. So I'll give you some examples. When I was studying Spanish, I would always struggle with the demonstratives, the ese and este, which is this and that. And I had a Spanish teacher tell me this rhyme that he used that was this and these have the t's. So that when I was never sure if it was this or if it was that, if it was ese, if it was este, I would always think which one has the t. And that would help me to remember. English has another one for spelling, I before E except after C. Another one for geography. Also when I was studying Spanish, another tip that I got from a teacher for recalling the countries of Central America was a sentence, my goodness, eating hot nachos causes pain. You see the first letter of each word corresponds to the country. So as you go north to south in Central America, each of the countries is there. So we have Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. So when I had to take a geography quiz, I would, instead of having to remember the order and the country, I would just remember, my goodness, eating hot nachos causes pain. And I would remember the order. Another one, this is very common, at least in the United States, for helping students to remember the colors of the rainbow, is they talk about Roy G. Biv, which is an abbreviation for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And that is to help kids remember the colors of the rainbow and the order that they come in. And I can see from a lot of your comments that a lot of you are familiar with these kinds of things. So you might not have known the word mnemonic, but you understand the concept. And especially as teachers who went through the experience of learning English, I'm sure you used a lot of these devices in your own learning. So it's really helpful to share these ideas with your students. Because if they're struggling to remember something, that's where you can say, here's a rhyme, here's an acronym. Or ask students how they remember it. So have people share their own ideas for a rhyme. If people are struggling to remember something, say, all right, how could we remember this? So I talked to you earlier about the dictionaries and the different kinds of dictionaries. One that I like is Wordreference. So as you can see, this is a dictionary, an online dictionary that you can search a word and it will give you the translation as well as a sentence, an example sentence, and the part of speech, all that, like any other dictionary. The thing that I like with Wordreference is, in case that's not clear, in case you're still not sure exactly how to use it, it has what's called a forum, which is a place where you could post a question. So if you're wondering still on, am I using this correctly? Could I use it in this sense? Am I using the right word? You could ask a question, and other users can post and respond so that you can get some interaction online with some language focus. The other one that I mentioned was Corpus. So Corpus is basically a database of authentic language use. So it is a collection of how language is actually used in the real world. Lingy is one website that, again, works as an online dictionary where it can give you a translation. So you see it has the word you're looking for, in this case skinny. It gives a definition, and it also gives other words that you could use for it, and some examples. But let's say that you are describing someone and you're not sure if you should use the word skinny or thin. So you're trying to find authentic examples of people using these words to figure out in which context it's more appropriate. That's where you can see at the bottom of this page there's the external sources. So that is a collection of this language being used in real context. So you could be able to click on the site, on the link, and see how skinny is used. Then type in thin and see how thin is used, in which context is one used versus another. And that can help you in case you're not sure of register or of use. Another strategy that I also like is, as a student of Chinese, there's a lot of characters to remember. The Chinese write-in system for me was very difficult to learn. So any strategy I could use to help myself remember was very effective and helpful. So you can see here that we have some basic characters, and they're illustrated so that they're made to look like what they mean. So mouth, for example. You see in the black outline is the character for mouth. And the artist went in and drew a mouth so that you associate the character with a mouth. You see the same in mountain. The character begins to look like a mountain or a door or a sun or the tree. So that way when you're trying to remember how all of this is, how the characters look, the picture, for me anyways, I told you I'm very visual, the pictures help me. And another thing you could do is, if you were teaching Chinese, have your students draw it. So yes, I studied Chinese for several years, and these little things, these little devices, always helped me to retain the vocabulary and to remember the characters, because especially learning a different writing system, it's very challenging. It's a lot to remember. So any little device that you can use to help you remember is a big help. right, the third component that I have identified for learner training has two parts. The first part is learning from each other with classmates. So that is having students use each other in the classroom as an aid and as a help. So providing opportunities for cooperative learning. So these could be things like think, pair, share, which is where you might ask a question and allow students a minute or so to think on their own, then turn to the person next to them and discuss before sharing out with the whole class. That time to think first and then talk to someone makes a big difference instead of just asking a question and getting those blank stares of people being too scared to answer or too uncertain. Those couple extra minutes of allowing students to talk with each other is very beneficial, which also can be expanded out into pair and small group work. So giving students opportunities to work together. Here's a task, try it with the person next to you. Complete this in small groups, which goes on to even larger things, not just activities or exercises, but going on to tasks or projects, where students have to rely on each other, assign different roles in order to complete an assignment or a task or a project. The other side of learning from each other is learning from the teacher. So them seeing you as the role model, as the guide, going back to those teacher roles that we talked about earlier. And a couple ways that this can be done is first, being upfront and explaining what you do and why you do it. So what's your approach to teaching? How do you correct and provide feedback? What do you think about language? How have you learned the language? Being a good role model, talking about strategies. Another is to state goals and expectations. So the goals being what you want the students to be able to do. Expectations being more behavioral expectations and more of actions. And asking for feedback. So not being afraid to ask your students how the class is going. How was that activity? Doing course evaluations or unit evaluations, something where you're giving the students the opportunity to communicate with you on how they feel the class is progressing. And the last component was learning from yourself. So this is that idea of reflection. So critical reflection to give lessons personal and real-world meaning. So these could be a couple of suggestions for how this could be done. First is a journal. Journals can be either private or dialogue. A private journal would just be asking students to take a notebook and either write whatever topic they feel like or giving them something targeted that you'd like them to reflect and think about. The other type of journal could be dialogue, where once again it's either a free topic or you give them a specific question or prompt. They write a response and then they either turn it into you or they could give it to a classmate. And either you or the classmate would then read the journal entry and write a response, so it becomes a written dialogue. So there's some back and forth with the journaling. And the journals could just, I see someone asking where to get the journals, and the journals could be as simple as a blank notebook or a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. The other is self-assessment questionnaires. So those are the things like the VARC quiz. I can show you at the last slide, there's a list where you can see the website. Having them take these self-assessments, having them assess themselves as a learner, also assess their progress, asking them to check in with themselves on how things are going. That can be the KWL, for example, if you remember that from the beginning. Another is identifying motivation. So asking students to think about why they're in class, why they're studying English, and where this will take them, which could then lead into the next one, which is goal setting. So having them think about where they want to get. Where do they want English to take them? How can this help them? Where do they want to go? So what does learner training look like? I've given you a lot of separate ideas, but just so that you can see something a little more concrete, I'll give you a sample course outline from a course that I taught. This was using the World English textbook. So if you see weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5, begin following the book. So each week we covered a unit of the textbook. But that first week of class in many institutions is often kind of a free week where there's people moving around with attendance, there's some placement being done in terms of level. So not to lose that week or to start jumping into content, but take advantage of that time for learner training to start the class off on the right foot, you could say. So you see this first week, the theme is getting ready to learn. And all of the activities of this week are centered around building community. So making sure that students feel that they are in a comfortable learning environment where they know who the teacher is, they know who their classmates are. So activities like Find Someone Who, Teacher Hot Seat. Also looking at the course and the rules and the goals so that they know what's being expected of them. Talking about why we're studying English, what's the purpose of it, how does English fit into the role, or into the world, excuse me. Looking at strategies, taking a learning styles quiz, writing letters to yourself so you can set a goal. Categories is a game for vocabulary. It's just a fun community building game. Same with the newlywed game too, but just things so that by the end of this week, the goal is that everyone knows each other's names and feels comfortable in the class. Once the content of the class begins, you see that there is still strategy and skill focus built in throughout the class. So one day of every week was for reading skills. So we would look at different skills like identifying vocabulary from context or defining vocabulary in context, summarizing, being aware of genre, looking at the elements of stories. There's also, before they have to write a report, talking about writing skills. So I've identified a couple of problems that I think many teachers hear from several different students. So I'm going to show you the problems, and I want you to think about what we've talked about in the last 45 minutes and how some of these learner training techniques could help you to either solve or avoid some of these problems. So problem number 1. I just started studying English, and it's so difficult. How can I be expected to remember so many new words? Raise your hand if you've ever heard your students say this problem before, or if you yourself have ever said this problem before. I see a lot of hands going up, so I think it's a pretty common problem. So how could you use learner training to address this problem? You can type your ideas right into the chat box. Thinking about what we've talked about, how can learner training help a student who's struggling to remember new vocabulary? Let's see. Students have different learning styles. Mnemonics is one. So remember, mnemonics are those rhymes, things to remember. Vocabulary journals. I see a lot of mnemonics. Personalizing. Flashcards. Yeah, flashcards. Pictionary is another fun one. So playing games. Yeah, different activities, either in class or out. Songs, too, that can engage the students to get them to work with the vocabulary so that it becomes more meaningful and more memorable. Yeah, jazz chants, flashcards, good. I see a lot of ideas. Excellent. Problem 2. I hate English class. I don't see the point. What good is English going to do me? So raise your hand once again if you've heard this issue before. I think this is something that is particularly common for teachers who work in public schools where English might be a mandatory part of the curriculum. Students might say, why do I have to take English? So I see a lot of hands going up, so I think it's a pretty common problem, something that you've definitely heard before. So again, I ask the question, how could learner training address this problem? You can use the chat box. If a student says they don't like English and they don't see the point, what could you do to help them with this? Yeah, we have someone saying to bring real-life situations into the classroom. Playing games, creating a community. Yeah, making class more fun, making it motivating. Someone says songs, and that's good. And songs are an authentic material that you can bring into the classroom. So that, a lot of people listen to songs in English. So bringing those songs that they're already listening to into the classroom is a way to get them interested because they'll want to know what it means. So, yeah, talking about your own experience, that's a good idea. Personalizing, bringing in magazines, bringing in stories, movies, TV shows, all of these things. Talking about English in the world, that idea that we had before, but getting them to see that English exists outside of the classroom. I think that's the key there. One more problem, problem 3. I'm too embarrassed to ask a question in class. I feel like I'm the only one who doesn't understand. I don't want everyone to think I'm stupid. So again, raise your hand if you have heard this problem before. I think this is particularly true with younger learners or high school learners, something where peer pressure is something that's a larger issue. So I see a lot of hands going up. So I think it's a pretty common problem. Yeah, in the chat box, people say common. So how could you use learner training to address this problem? You can type your ideas into the chat box again. Yeah, adults as well. So a lot of people can have this problem. Teamwork, engagement, pair work. Yeah, so going back, games. Yeah, going back to that idea of cooperative learning, creating that learning community where people feel safe to make a mistake or to take a risk or to try something different. So I see the think, pair, share, small groups, giving feedback. That's a good idea. It could be something more personal. So if the student feels that they're put on the spot or they're not comfortable, giving them the opportunity to provide you with some personal feedback could really help you in how you approach the class. Working groups, yeah, modeling activities, conversations. Yeah, it seems like you get the main idea. Great. So before we leave, just want to give a couple final tips for implementation in case this was something that was new to you. I think from your comments and from your participation, it seems like these ideas for learner training may not be anything that's new, but a lot of times it's just that reminder of how to bring it into the classroom. So the first, be patient and provide plenty of opportunities for students to practice and strengthen their skills. If you try something new and it doesn't work, don't give up on it. Try it again, because strategy instruction and helping your students through the learning process will make them stronger, more independent learners, like we had discussed earlier. And the final point is to be resourceful. So if you like this idea, but you're not quite sure how to implement it, consult with colleagues. You can talk to people you work with, people in your network, look at publications, join professional networks, even online. If you look for online resources, there's a lot out there if you're interested in learning styles, for example, and you want to know where to find a quiz. Be resourceful. Talk to colleagues. Have you ever done this? How did it work? Look things up. A lot of journals, a lot of sources. So another great resource is also the Ning page, which was mentioned in the beginning. So if you have any ideas for learner training, things that you've done, any tips or strategies, successes, please share them. I'm looking forward to reading them and hearing more about them. So thank you, everyone, for your participation. Here are a couple of resources for you. You can see the VARC, a couple of readings. If you want more information on learner training and how it can be implemented and used with your students. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to hearing more of your ideas and experiences on the post-webinar need. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maggie, for sharing those excellent ideas for developing our students' autonomy. You provided some great ideas that we can all use to train our students to improve their own learning strategies. We also look forward to the post-webinar discussion and to exploring your Ning resource page. And we'd also like to thank you, our audience, for your active participation today. We look forward to learning with you again in 2 weeks on March 29th when Crystal Bach Thesis